work with the Leadership Circle, and I manage a team of people whose role is to help support all of you when certified in making meaningful things happen with the Leadership Circle assessment tools. Awesome to be with all of you guys. Thanks for joining. Today, we've got a 1-hour webinar. The purpose of this webinar, assuming all of you are already familiar with the Leadership Circle framework and are certified, this webinar is about another assessment offered called the Collective Leadership Assessment. So we're going to provide an overview of what that assessment is, how it's similar and different from the Leadership Circle 360. There's some common questions to help make the differentiation, why there's value in using it. We have a special guest. We have a client who's very experienced with using both the 360 and the collective leadership, which will probably slip in, as we call it, the CLA. So Heather will be sharing her story with this as well. And we have a little bit of time for Q&A. As often is the case, there might be more questions that we'll get to in an hour. If available, and if you have questions, I plan to stay on for a little while when we're done here. But if your questions aren't answered, we'll invite you to put questions into the chat. And if we don't cover everything on those questions, we'll be sure to follow up with all of you. Joining me today, we got the A team. Joining me is Tyson Andrus as our facilitator. Say hey, Tyson.
Hello, everybody.
From our marketing team, we've got Douglas, and we've got Amanda, and Carly. So we've got the full team here. So it's good to have all of you here. And with that, Tyson, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Okay. So great to have everyone here. We'll always start out with our purpose at Leadership Circle, even if it is just an hour-long webinar. So I'm sure you're used to that if you were with us for certification recently, or you remember it if it's been a little bit of time. But we exist to evolve the conscious practice of leadership, to steward the planet, and to awaken us all to our inherent unity. And with that, we'll be talking about collective leadership. And it wouldn't be a Leadership Circle session if we didn't start out with a check-in through a breakout. So we are going to do a little bit of a quick check-in for a couple of minutes. This is just going to be 5 minutes with a group of 3. The check-in today, before we really jump into the material, is what advantages do you see in working teams? So what are the advantages you see in working teams collectively in their development? So what advantage do you see in working a team collectively in their development at the same time? So we'll just have 5 minutes with a group of 3. We'll come back together, talk about that a little bit, and we'll jump into the collective leadership assessment. So advantage over what? Okay, welcome back, everybody. Always, I'm sure, just a little bit of like really a breakout. I just wanted to be a part of a webinar in the background, but always helpful. So it's just part of the conversation. What came up is what's so helpful when you're able to work a team together rather than just one-on-one coaching without the team. What'd you notice is the advantage?
Well, in our breakout group, we actually came up with, if the team knows that they are working, if somebody is working on improving themselves in a particular area, then the team can actually call that out and say, great job in that meeting of stepping up on there.
Yeah, really powerful. Peer accountability within that team is immensely powerful. Good. What else? A couple others.
Hey, it's Sandy.
Hey, Sandy.
Hi. We talked about how trust is built so quickly and deeply when people are willing to share what they normally hide. And how what we get to experience is kind of sacred ground. So we looked at it from both perspectives. It was beautiful.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Love that. Good. What else?
So we talked about, good morning, everyone. It's Tracy.
Good morning.
Good morning. So we talked about a few things. One, how systemically important it is to have a common language and framework, and also to create self-awareness, just not for oneself, but within the team, helps really improve the level of impact that you have in their development. And then also about the benefit of diversity and having different backgrounds and people contributing from different points of view. So that was a little bit about what we covered.
No, I love that. Absolutely. It can feel like a siloed experience if it's just a one-on-one coaching and then they go back out into the ether by themselves on that
Exactly.
conversation. Yeah, so good to have diversity of thought and being able to work with each other on how that's landing, on observations, real-time feedback. Yeah, very powerful. One more.
I think, hi, my name is Gina.
Hi,
I
Gina.
think it's actually a bit of a yes and, because I think that there is an opportunity to go deep and to really make a significant impact when you're working one-on-one with an individual and you have a chance to have some of those really powerful conversations.
Yes.
At the same time, that individual exists within a context, as do all of the individuals in that context. So for me, the ideal is to be able to say, for example, to work with a leader and to work with their team.
Yeah.
So I don't see it as a one or an either or, but rather as a yes and.
Great clarification. I would feel the exact same. So being able to be in the deep conversation individually and then be able to work them collectively. So you're able to use all that is in their real reality, all in the collective field, their individual coaching. That gives you great accessibility. And with that note, just to refresh on some of that individual coaching and how we can work together as a group. Everyone here is most likely certified in the Leadership Circle profile. But as we look at that, just to refresh here, want to check, can you see that group profile?
Yes.
Okay. So when we're looking at this is an aggregation of the individual profiles. So this would be a senior team. And with that, we'd be able to really sense into collecting the individual profiles. So that would tap right into I've already coached everyone individually, or my team of coaches has coached everyone individually. And then we get them together and they can look at their group profile. For just by raise of hands, has anyone had an opportunity to use the group profile with a team yet? A few? Okay, so for those that have risen their hand, what did you notice when using the group profile with a team? What kind of output did you get?
I'll jump in. For me, I was a little disappointed because it like balanced out the people who were one way and people who were the opposite way, and it came across kind of vanilla.
Yep.
And there was a limited amount to really work with.
Yeah, good. No, good call out. So then that's a really good opportunity to work the team and how they are canceling each other out. So really good conversation there, and just good call out. How are we making ourselves vanilla? Right? So good. What are some other experiences on the group profile?
Yeah, I'll share. In the last one that I did, there was a vanillaizing for sure. But as we made meaning of it together, what we saw was there was a tendency for people to be to be on the complying side. And so what that brought up is, are we being most effective if we're not having crucial conversations with each other? And then we could leverage that into a one big theme team goal, which is, we're going to really practice engaging in crucial conversations. And then for me as facilitator, I could begin to raise the heat in the room purposefully and intentionally in support of their development.
Really, really good. So there is that initial passive, well, wait, what does it mean? And then being able to sit with it, with the team, say, okay, what does this mean for us? What is our leadership brand showing up? I use the language, where's our center of gravity? Meaning if we were to put a ball in the center of this, where are we rolling to? So it can be really helpful for a team to really consider their collective profile. But with that, we have to be conscious that it's really helpful conversation, really helpful for the team to look at the aggregate, but it is an aggregate, meaning it's just pulling all individual profiles together. So this is where the collective leadership assessment gets to become extremely useful, especially in tandem when we're using both with a group, because the left one, the leadership circle profile, is an aggregate of individual profiles. So green shading the aggregate of how others are seeing them, black line the aggregate of their self-assessment. The one on the right, the collective leadership assessment, is the leadership team or whatever the grouping is assessed as a team. So it's one assessment to say, how is this team showing up? Really helpful conversation because we all know that not all teams are equal to the sum of their parts. Michael spending a little bit more time on this, but we're not always, if you think we're all great individual contributors, so we must be great as a team. I'm sure all of us have experienced that not to be the case. So when we're assessed as a team, how does that show up? So when we're looking at this, leadership circle profile is a roll up of the collective individual. It's a focus of the analysis on the individual and the scores are aggregated across the select group. It's diagnostic in nature for the leadership circle profile group. It allows a senior team or a group to contemplate potential reactive or creative patterns, as Michael was talking about, being able to turn up the heat on really important conversations. Now, the collective leadership assessment, we'll spend more time with this, of course, in the little bit of time we have today, but measures the gap between current leadership effectiveness or actual and aspirational leadership effectiveness and the ideal. So where are they at currently and where do they hope to be? So the focus of the analysis is actually on the collective and it's directional in nature. So this can be really utilized for a team saying, okay, where are we and where do we want to go? The collective leadership assessment will set that trajectory for you. And you can actually be with a team on that. So the leadership circle profile allows you to get a snapshot of what's going on right now. The collective leadership assessment can allow you to be directional in the conversation, what's going on right now and where do we want to go. So let's just look at this and how it shows current versus ideal. So the blue is their current or actual. The black line is the ideal. So just to call out this distinction clearly, the previous assessment, the black line was self-assessment, the shading was others assessment. For this one, the shading is the current state of the team, the black line is the ideal state. So let's leverage just what we have in the room right now. If this was with what you know just here, because this is just the inside circle, as you notice. If this was a team you're working and this was their results on current and ideal, what do you notice? Let's do a little bit of interpretation practice. What do you notice with this team?
There's a pretty good sized gap.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Pretty good sized gap on where they're at versus where they want to be. What else?
More reactive than creative.
Yeah, good, Charmin. Absolutely. More reactive than creative. What else are we seeing? This is current and ideal state.
Could I ask how the ideal state is defined?
Yeah, so good question. So the ideal state is defined. So what we've done is that there's 124 questions for the collective leadership assessment. 62 are about where are you at currently? Another 62 at where would you like to be?
They're the same 62 repeated, right?
They're the same 62 repeated, so they don't change. So you have the exact same rationale and logic for your current versus your ideal state. So when you look at
either totally, does that mean they're totally idealistic about where they would want to be? You know, a little unrealistic?
Well, good
it's
question.
hard to say, right?
Good question. So when working a team on their ideal state, their aspirational state, what's in that, right? So
right.
If we could say, so they could have said, we want 100 percentile. We want 5s across the board on the creative and 0s across the board in the reactive. So
right.
There is a natural conversation on the choices that they've made in here. So when you're looking at current versus ideal, look at the black line on the reactive. Which one is this team a little less willing to let go of when you're looking at the ideal?
Controlling.
So that's an interesting conversation for this team.
Well, and I was going to say, this is Tracy, without knowing any background, I would actually look at the complying piece. And my assumption might be, this is an organization that wants more innovation, that wants more risk taking than what maybe the leaders are adapt to. And that's why the protecting and the complying are close as it relates to lower, and they're okay, so to speak, with the level of control, as long as there's innovation. That would be my guess.
Good, good. I love that. That's a great door opening conversation for this team as they're looking at what they want versus what they're experiencing currently. Really good. So just a little background context on this graphic. This is a banking organization. So I see a couple of smiles as you see a little bit of let's get rid of comply, a little bit more control, a little bit of laughing faces. So we've all worked some of those organizations, right? So how could that be helpful for this organization to look at the results, considering the data I just gave you on banking?
Maybe one thing they could look at is that their orientation may be more towards complying and controlling. And you know, some of those things, I mean, I've had bankers tell me, don't tell me to be creative in my negotiating. I mean, that's against the law.
Right.
So maybe helping them identify what areas absolutely have to be complied with. And they probably know that already, but it's a good refresher. And in what areas could we expand our thinking?
Really good. So just the space for a team to sit with, what have we faced as a complying organization? And we say that we want to bring that down to the 20th percentile. So what does that open up as opportunity for us now? Really good. So let's go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, from the controlling perspective, the conversation that we just had about how they kind of want to still be controlling, I guess testing their assumptions and beliefs that they have to be that way, right? Is it an excuse, or is it truly justified? And if so, how do you still help them mitigate that in a way that doesn't sacrifice, you know, the quality of the relationships and trust and so forth?
Beautiful challenge, Tracy. Love that. Yeah. Allow the team to sit with that conversation, right? So this is the gift of the collective leadership assessment. These are their results. So they get to sit with where are we now versus where do we want to be? And that conversation opens up around complying, controlling, and even where we set in the creative. So this is just a sample. I can keep going, but this is just a sample when we're looking at the collective leadership assessment. Yes, Brian.
Whenever we're looking at, so that makes sense on the where to maybe guide some of the conversation with the reactive. When we're looking at the creative, in my eyes, I don't see something really jumping off the page. Any input on sort of what you do with that, sort of where you guide that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just test with the group. What hits you when you look at the creative? What information are you seeing when you look at the top half?
What pops up for me is the achieving bar is quite a bit different than the actual. And so there would be a lot of, I think, conversations about, you know, as a team, where are we missing the mark? What do we want to do less of? What do we want to do more of? Try to move the blue pattern closer to the black line.
Good.
And that of course connects with systems and authenticity, self-awareness, and also relating.
Good.
Brian, if I heard your question correct, you're not seeing a lot of data to work with just yet. This is high-level conceptual. There is still a 14-page report to accompany this that'll get into the details about every one of the competencies. So more explanation to follow past beyond this conceptual overview.
Tracy, you had something?
Yeah, Tyson, what I was going to say, again, not knowing anything, as Mike just said, without looking at the details, I would sit back and go, knowing it's banking in the creative space, what people may be craving is more information, more openness, more understanding of what's behind the controls, what's behind why we need to do what we're doing. That's where I would go initially without looking at anything else.
Well, and I love that because that taps into what David was saying around purpose and vision being an achieving, right? And strategic focus versus just control. So if we're able to let go of this partner a little bit, this companion, and actually step into achieving, what does that look like? Good.
Right.
Couple more and then we need to move forward.
Yeah, but the relating.
Yeah, and then let go of that controlling into relating. Absolutely.
And one thing I see right out of the gate is that their authenticity, their actually existing authenticity is relatively high, which it tells me that they're willing to move further into telling the truth about what's not working to each other.
Good.
And that gives them actually a pretty good leverage starting point for advancing their creativity in the other dimensions.
Good. So access what they're already showing up with and leverage that for the conversation.
Right.
Good. Michael, and then Stephen, and then we'll have to move forward.
Let's see, two things for me. On the reactive side, what I take away from the instrument, it's not that controlling or protecting or complying are bad in any way. They're in the banking business, they need to do that stuff. The issue is whether it's a compulsive automatic reaction, i.e. I have to do that and I don't have space to be more creative. So I'd be looking at what's the automaticity of the reaction of this group in that reactive side. And as the last speaker said, the thing that points out to me on the creative side is the authenticity of this group. I think 50% is a fairly high score, and I would be emphasizing that.
Yeah, really good. And so when you're looking at that reactive, it's not to meet it with anger or fix. It's about why have we done it? And now let's look at the beliefs and assumptions we're holding. And is there any reticence or fear of letting it go?
Yeah.
Good. Stephen.
Thanks, Tyson. Can you help us interpret the relationship task balance bar? From what I could tell, the balance is not particularly high, but their aspiration, their desired balance is actually lower than their actual balance, which is surprising.
Yeah, that one's a nuance in the data. When you start to get to the far edges, that little bit of separation, when you get really, really high there, it actually creates that bar moving to the middle. So that's just a nuance when the bar gets really, really high between relating and achieving, because it's informed by creative relating, creative achieving. So that's how that is impacted when it gets really, really high. That small degree of difference is actually exaggerated in percentile.
Kind of the foundation of statistics, we're working kind of towards the tails on the bell-shaped curve.
Yep. All right. So let's move forward because we have a lot of great content as always and not enough time as always. So another favorite thing that I have from the collective leadership assessment, which you can access in the longer form report, which kind of ties into what Brian and Michael were talking about. You can actually pull the sort table in the report. And there's a sort table where you can actually, it's sorted by actual on the left-hand side and sorted by ideal on the right-hand side. So highest to lowest current on the left, highest to lowest ideal on the right. And as Bob would say, the story is in the movement, meaning where things move allows you to get insight into the organization. So when you're looking at this Bing organization, the top 10 on the left-hand side versus the requested top 10 on the right-hand side. What's some of the movement that would lean into even some of the conversation we were already touching on when we were looking at just a graphic? What are some of the insights you can begin to pull?
Tell me more about what you mean about the story is in the movement.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Great question. So one of the movement stories you can see here, what happens to driven from current to ideal? So driven can make sense in a banking organization where we're saying push for results, go, go, go. But when we say, well, what's the ideal state? When we all said, what do we want ideally? Driven moves to a bottom 10 versus a top 1 on the current. And then it taps into what we were talking about earlier on what was called out by David in the achieving request. You can see on the right-hand side, what's the top value? Top 2 values. Strategic focus and purpose and vision. So this opens up a conversation on what's getting in their way of the current state and what they're hoping for in the ideal state. So the conversation can really open up just by looking at what movement has taken place of their current to their ideal. And of course, in certification, we spend much more time on this, practice this, read through, highlight the differences, get better and better at noticing the new movement. But I want to point out just even the short minutes that we have, that this is a gift to have for a team. So they can actually get into the specifics of where they're at currently and where they hope to be, and notice what is moving from top to bottom or bottom to top. Because if we're looking here around balance, we're looking at that being at the bottom, or even the desire to have sustainable productivity. But if you look at the top, that moves to the top. So it would make sense in a culture that's highly driven, why sustainable productivity might bump up to the top in tandem and pairing with strategic focus and purpose and vision. So I know that's a lot, but I just want to give you that this is all accessible with the collective leadership assessment, and why this instrument is just so powerful. One other thing, and then I'm going to actually hand it over to Mike to kind of discuss a little bit more. Another great thing that you can have when you're designing the collective leadership assessment is how you can actually design the report. So let's say that the executive team is the one that I want to get assessed on the collective leadership assessment, but I want feedback from the board and their 2 direct reporting teams, ELT1, ELT2. I can do that as one assessment. So this is another, and Mike will spend more time on this, a cost advantage to be able to getting a lot of data without it getting really expensive. So I can actually do one assessment, and after the assessment is done, as long as I know who is who, I can actually afterwards cut out the data and actually show the team, okay, this is by you. If I look at this one, collective leadership assessment, this is what we say is our current versus ideal, but here's what the board is saying our current versus our ideal is. And oh, okay, here's what our direct report ELT1 is saying current versus ideal. So you can get really valuable data on how the team is viewing themselves and how they're being viewed from outside in. So really continuous and really valuable conversation on feedback. So I just wanted to give you that that's another valuable lens that the CLA, the collective leadership assessment, can do. All right, Mike, I'll give it to you.
Okay, terrific. Great, thank you. And if I could just do a quick summary, the collective leadership assessment, which by the way, used to be called the Leadership Culture Survey. So it's still the same, we just changed the name. I'll give some explanation there. It's based on the same research, the same validation, the same rigor statistically. The difference is, instead of looking at me as a one-on-one leader with a 360, it's looking at all of us as a collective team. And instead of my one-on-one feedback being my self-assessment versus others, it's how we see ourselves currently and what we aspire to. So everything you all know about creative and reactive is still relevant. And when you're working one-on-one with an individual leader, you might be working towards a development journey of not boiling the ocean, but hey, Mike, what are the 1 or 2 creative competencies you could really put differential attention towards? And maybe the one reactive tendency you could give a fresh look at and learn how to manage better. The same thing will apply with the teams of groups of people that you work together with. So a collective team looking at the data and with your support, identifying the couple of creative competencies they can collectively work towards, and maybe a one reactive tendency they can learn to manage better. So with that, if you could put back on the screen, Tyson. One other element as we look at these sort tables, another really powerful piece. Tyson referred to Bob Anderson's piece about the stories in the movement. There's another really cool sort table. And forgive me if you saw this and I missed it, Tyson. There's also one that just sorts it by gap. So of all the competencies, these are the ones that are the highest gap between where you all see yourselves currently and where you aspire to be, as is illustrated in this one right here. So this group is looking for, on the right-hand side, more balance. All things being equal, balance is the one they're seeing a need for more of that. Next is decisiveness, then integrity. And you continue on, and then Tyson, if you can scroll to the bottom, you'll see these negative numbers with the red. These are reactive energies they want to see less of. So this group collectively, the 14 people that participated, want to see less driven and less belonging and less conservative. Now, you as a change management practitioner, you can then work with this team to help make those shifts. You have access to this profile interpretation manual. You can use that just as well and just as relevantly with groups of people to help them set developmental priorities as a group. So with all that, Tyson, if we could go back to the screen, I am gonna just give a quick summary, realizing I'm preaching to the choir. If we go to full screen here, Tyson. You all know this, but leadership is really, really important. Can we go into full screen, guys? Versus, let's see, yeah, there you go, I thought. Leadership is really, really important. All the research shows, we all know this, leadership is perhaps the greatest lever in organizations achieving outcomes that they care about. We know that leadership and culture are more relevant and prevalent than strategy and everything else. And so while there's a very long list here, this was developed, you all know this already, but this will be sent to you in follow-up. With leadership being the most important, the benefit of a group working together to identify how they can show up and create the right culture is what the real invitation is. So if we look at creative and reactive from the most fundamental level, people who are working for an organization that's in the creative, where they're looking for real meaning making and real purpose, they're mentoring and developing, and they're being authentic with each other, and they've got sustainability, people will thrive. They will scale more in that environment versus the alternative about me working within an organization that has a lot of conservatism, play it safe, perhaps a lot of arrogance about them. I will tend to not thrive. And with our books, Mastering Leadership was the first one published maybe 5 years ago. It speaks to the whole element about when the aggregate gets together, it tends to pull us down. We tend to all deviate towards the mean to a mediocrity, or working towards that. There's a lot of challenge with that, one of which is the really good high-performing contributors. They tend to get tired of that environment and go elsewhere. And then you're kind of just stuck with this ever-present cycle of going downwards. Our newest book, Scaling Leadership, really popular in the community. If you haven't picked it up yet, I highly encourage you to do it. This book really talks about making meaning making happen at scale. So we changed the name of this assessment to the Collective Leadership Assessment to more align with the philosophies of this book about scale. Organizational scale happens when the group of us are all working together towards organizational outcomes. And you'll get a bigger contribution collectively than the one-on-one work we do with each individual leader. So with all that in mind, conceptually, Tyson, if you'll move forward, a screenshot of the developmental process will be coming in a minute, but the journey is starting with ourselves first, one-on-one, then developing ourselves as a team, and then working as the entire system. Our guest speaker, Heather, will be talking about how she's used both the 360 and the collective leadership in unison with leaders that she serves within her organization. It all goes towards the whole piece about the entire organization rising to a higher level of consciousness than dealing with the level of consciousness they had when the problems had started. And we all know this slide. I'm sure you've seen it before, but there's this world we live in. The upper right shows the volatile world that we're all amongst. And on the right-hand side is where we are as individuals and collectively, and where we are in our stage work. And that demand in the middle is the developmental challenge. So when you look at this as an individual, the Leadership Circle 360 contributes to your helping leaders through all this. And when we're looking at the collective team, the same model applies. But here, when you have the team's complexity together on the left-hand side, one more advanced, Tyson. This illustrates where not only does the team's collective energy get less than, but it also increases the developmental challenge. The collective leadership, along with your insight, coaching, your everything you contribute, one more slide, it's intended to tighten up that developmental challenge, and then one more, increase their ability to work in a more transformational way. So conceptually, that's what this piece is all about. And so with all that from a business perspective, it's really building the case for the one-on-one work that we're doing is very, very meaningful. But if you could get the collective, all of you together on the same page, working towards a couple of key priorities. So across the organization, there's a whole new brand that looks more creative, and we're owning and being responsible for better managing our reactive. That's the journey. And it's really well, again, depicted in this Scaling Leadership book. So with all that, we covered a lot here, but Beth said, I'm really pleased to introduce Heather. Heather Esposito is with Herman Miller. She's a senior manager working with leadership development across the entire globe. She's based in New Orleans, and she's going to tell us a little bit about how they're using both the Leadership Circle profile and the collective leadership assessment at Herman Miller.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. As Mike mentioned, I do work for Herman Miller. We are a global commercial furniture manufacturer that is located in West Michigan, but I happen to be a remote employee, but I'm privileged to lead the team that does global leadership development. And our language of our leadership model is based upon the core foundations of Leadership Circle language. So it is integrated throughout everything that we do, and the tools support the work that we ask leaders to do. So kind of the case study that I was going to bring to you today is our senior sales team. So the leader of this team is an LT +1 level, and then his direct reports was the group that we took on this journey. We use the leadership circle throughout the organization, but this was our first group that we took through kind of the whole entire process. They had been with me on a coaching and development journey for quite some time. So they were big advocates and fans, and I knew they would, they'd be willing to pilot this with me. And we started off, so let me just set a little context. This leader had recently been promoted to lead this team. Very, very capable leader, young, energetic leader. But one of the challenges he was particularly facing is that he had not carried the bag in the same way that his direct reports had. And so when I started doing this more expanded work with the team, it was really about helping them gel and helping him build credibility and establishing the value that he could provide as their leader, which wasn't going to come from the same expertise that his direct reports had, who had worked their way up in a different way in the organization. And so we did start off with the individual circles to really understand what they each were going to take on as their developmental agenda. We brought it together into the group report so they could see how that came together. And I will say that exercise, first and foremost, was the thing that was the pivot and turning point in the group gelling together. They were vulnerable with each other in ways they had not before. They started asking each other to hold the team and themselves accountable to different work. And there were several in the group that had higher pleasing scores. And so, some of the ways that they were asking each other to hold themselves accountable was, if you think that I'm just going along to get along, ask me, is that really what you think? Or do you think that's what we need to say here? Or that's what you're expected to say? If you hear me being quiet, ask me to share my perspective and opinion and call that out, because this is something that I'm working on, my courageous authenticity. And so they came into it with, hey, we've all got something we're working on. We've all got something we're trying to get better at. And we have a pretty big agenda that we're taking on. And this was the fall of 2019 when we started this work. At the same time, we did the collective leadership assessment, and they were, their gaps were much larger than what you saw in the sample diagram, which was very eye-opening about what was important to them and the work ahead. Now, unfortunately, several months, or like about the time that we were supposed to come back for the next debrief and the next check-in on that, COVID had happened. And so we have put less emphasis on the results of the collective leadership assessment, and we've been doubling down on their collective development work. I'm responsible for 1,100 leaders across the organization. We're getting ready to go through an acquisition right now, which will add somewhere between 300 to 500 more leaders into the organization. So for me, collective development is critical. It's the only way that my team can help this work to scale. So I don't even see collective development as optional or a nice to have. It's really the only way we're going to be effective. And so we have doubled down with that team in some really powerful, great ways about how they can leverage the work married to the business conversation. The challenges they've been faced with over this last year, I don't know if you caught, we're in the commercial furniture industry. So we furnish offices with furniture. Nobody's been in their offices for the last 15 months. So that has had a significant impact on our business. It gave us growth opportunities in other areas to help people with more effective home offices. But now we're helping people navigate what return to office looks like and what kind of spaces do they need to create. There has been a number of complex business issues that this team has had to face, tough conversations that they've had to enter into. And it's been really rewarding when I do their individual coaching to hear them say, I really fought my pleasing here, but I really felt like this was something I needed to take a stand for. This was a position I needed to advocate for. Here's how I equipped myself in that conversation. And even though they may not say, I'm working on my leadership circle work, they're working on their leadership circle work. And so, but we have not forgotten about the collective leadership assessment. They've been talking about that. Like, we need to get back to that, because they knew as a new leadership team, they were going to have to kind of establish this culture they wanted to create, and they really needed to make a decision as a team about where that focus was going to be dedicated. And so that's the work that will pick up more in earnest again when they have their first on-site in the next couple of months. But they have not forgotten about it. It's been in the back of their mind. It was eye-opening for them to see that, because it was their ideal, not an ideal that, oh, this is what you should be as a team. No, it's what they said they wanted to be. And there were some really significant gaps on the things that they felt were most important. And so I'm excited to get back more in earnest to do that work. But putting the whole ecosystem together makes a tremendous difference in the level of impact, the level of commitment, and I think the level of mutual accountability. So I'll check back in with the chat because I haven't been watching it while I've been sharing how we've been using it. But
Heather, thank you so much.
Huge fans.
It's been really remarkable being a part of the Herman Miller transitions and transformation over the last couple of years. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I had a moment to just check in on chat. Let me just really quickly just hit a few quick points. A really good question came in from Stephen. You can order the Leadership Circle profile a few different ways. Unlike a 360 where you're doing an assessment of Mike O'Connor, with the CLA, you can say, I'd like to get a team view, just look at the executive team, or I could also order it to be an organization-wide view. So imagine the entire organization talking about how leadership is overall. Both of those are an option. What's really nice about all of this, unlike the defensiveness and all the emotions I have with how I'm accepting my feedback in my 360 report, with the collective leadership assessment, you're reporting back what they've said about themselves. So you all said, this is an area you want more of. So it tends to have a lot more abundance and forward motion. The new challenge is having them all kind of agree rather quickly on which couple of these will we decide to make our priority. And then finally, just a quick comment, it comes up with all leadership circle assessments. The banking question came up earlier. It's very appropriate. You know, you might have a lot of controls or regulations within your organization operationally. That doesn't mean controlling leadership needs to happen in your team meetings or as you're developing or creating the culture. So you'll get these people, especially the highly protecting ones, I'm supposed to be controlling. That's what I do as an auditor. Yes, you do. Organizationally, that's your role. But as a leader, you can still put abundant energy towards creating an organization where things thrive. So the controlling organizational systems aren't what's needed as far as how you show up as a leader.
Good. So we want to take advantage of having someone that's been in the work of the work, and you don't have to listen to Mike or I too much. So are there questions for Heather, who has been deep in application for collective leadership assessment or even the leadership circle profile, or using the group profile?
I have a question, Tyson. When you were talking about the loss of business because of COVID, you know, that almost immediately puts fear into the system, and people go right to, am I going to lose my job? How did how did you deal with that, and how did these assessments help you understand what's going on with people in that context?
And so I'll say a couple of pieces about that. We also very heavily lean into the psychological safety work from the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership and their safety model. So that's the language we use to talk about our triggers and how we can better meet those needs, which marries really nicely at the leadership level to those leaders who also have an LCP. But that's the language we use at every employee level, is those fundamental human needs, those safety needs of the brain that we have for creating psychological safety. with the leaders, especially the ones, and that's a little bit what I was referring to, the leaders who were having to make those decisions, because we did have one reduction during COVID, and that was where some of those conversations about, I did not let my pleasing get in the way of just, hey, we have to hit a target, but let me tell you about really what's happening in the market and why that's not the right way to look at this. Like, let's look at really what's going on, and are we going to be prepared when we come out of this, and what are the right decisions? Yes, I know we need to hit some financial targets, but we also don't want to strap ourselves. We do believe COVID will be over one day and people will come back to the offices, and we don't want to be in a negative position. So there was the conversation around pleasing for sure. The other conversation where we saw it a lot was in the controlling and the driven, and leaders saying like, this is how we have to do it, and kind of becoming a little more autocratic and a little bit more of keep your head down, and that was a little bit more of a reactive stance. And we just called it out and said, you know, how is this showing up for you? What is it triggering for you, and how you're leading, and how do you want to be leading, and how would you deploy that differently? And so knowing that's one of the ways that we talk about the reactive is it's where you self-protect. And even if you do a pretty good job, you know, and maybe your profile, I see a lot where leaders are creative, but their self scores in the reactive don't match their evaluators. So like, they know what runs in the background for them. They do a very good job of overriding it and managing it in their day-to-day work. And they're definitely operating more creatively. One of the things we talk about is that is your safety zone, because, and you know it because you've self-evaluated yourself there. So that's the thing to be attuned to and aware of when you start feeling overwhelmed, at risk, emotionally exposed, all of those things, feeling more vulnerable. Is what is that for you, and how are you watching for it? What does it look like? And what do you want to do differently when you start to either see, feel, hear that coming out? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's good input about how people are feeling, but in terms of the decisions that they're making ultimately, and the choices about outplacing people, and did you see that was changed? Maybe you didn't reduce when you thought you maybe had to, and you paid the price for that, but now they're on board. So as business comes back, you've got the skill set. I'm just wondering, you know, the ramifications of some of those decisions.
Yep, they actually, there was one opportunity where it could potentially have resulted in a second reduction. And because that team went against their pleasing and came about it from a more creative standpoint, they ended up not doing that second reduction.
Excellent.
And
thank you.
it was, you know, like, of course, hindsight's 2020. It was the right decision to weather that out. But I mean, there was an inherent risk involved in that.
Okay.
Okay, so we're on our final few minutes, so want to open the space just for a few questions, and then Mike will stay after for those that have burning questions that want to stay with us. But we'll also be, Amanda will be sending this recording out as well as some additional material. So some remaining questions as you're sitting with them in our final few minutes together.
Yeah, I've got a question. It's interesting when I look at the collective, because this suggests this is what the organization is doing, and this is what I like the organization to be. The question I have is when you look at individual behaviors saying, well, I want you to change, but by the way, I'm okay. Okay. And how do you deal with that? I mean, from a coaching point of view, because I get concerned about using the collective if the people in the organization themselves are unwilling to change. And put that out there and say, well, this is what we want everybody else to do. Am I going to do more damage, or am I actually going to help by doing that?
Really good dynamic to bring up, Kenneth. So that's one where and so I'll just answer from my personal practice and working with clients. I like to pair this up with using the leadership circle profile before using the collective leadership assessment. That's from my perspective, because then they each have their own individual trajectory and ownership of where they're contributing and where they're showing up. And then the collective leadership assessment allows them to then take the directional conversation of, okay, where are we at and where do we want to go? How are we being experienced as a team? That's my perspective. I want to bring up the other perspective that I've heard, especially for those that might be working globally with an organization that might have we think collectively first, then we think individually. I do know that can show up in certain regions in the world. So I've seen people open up with the collective leadership assessment and say, yes, this is how you're showing up. Now let's look at your individual. So they actually use the collective leadership assessment as the entry into the door, and then use that to get into individual coaching. My preference has been individual coaching, and then leverage that into the collective. Good question.
I would just add to that, that if organizations are going to take on this work, I mean, you would hope, to use some of Keegan's language, that they're a deliberately developmental organization, and that we kind of set this for us, because I'm internal, so I have more influence over that culture, is that we all have a role to develop. Like, not developing is not an option. Our industry is requiring it. Our world is requiring it. And if we're not taking on our own development agenda, we are going to lose ground. And so there's not a curriculum or a university for that. But the idea of what's the thing that we all need to do and shift that enables us to get to the business outcomes that we're trying to create. So it's not just development for the sake of development. We're always putting it into the business conversation. So if I need to lead more effectively a remote hybrid team, what do I need to shift as my leader to be successful in my leadership to be successful at that? So I have a reason that I want to do it as well, because I'm trying to get to a business outcome that we've all agreed is valuable, that requires new kinds of leadership.
Yeah, and that pulls directly from Mike referenced the book Scaling Leadership. True leadership starts with leadership of self, then leadership of team, then leadership of organization. If a team tries to skip to the end and abandons leadership of self or leadership of team, they will not go as well as they would have expected. Go ahead, Doug.
I was just going to add one thing there too. I think that's the power of the collective leadership assessment, is that for those leadership teams that maybe think, everybody else needs to change, but we're okay, they have that. The assessment allows them, as Mike was showing, the team to look at themselves and say, okay, here's where we are and here's where we want to be, but also, the board, your direct reports, whoever you want to pull into that, all of a sudden you're seeing this very clear picture of, okay, this is where we are, and where, and then if I'm doing my LCP individually as well, like, it just opens up this huge conversation of where we are and where we want to actually be. It's much easier than saying, well, this is where you need to be, but it's where do we want to be collectively.
Good. Mike, for those that are wanting to sign up for collective leadership assessment, where could they find it?
Terrific. You go to theleadershipcircle.com. Upper right-hand corner, click on certifications. You'll find it there. In North America, we offer this session about once a month virtually. It's a one-day session. There's a lot of times to choose it. There are times where we offer it in a one-day format. Other times we offer it in 2 half days. So you have some flexibility there. The cost is $995. It assumes that you've got the Leadership Circle assessment certification as a prerequisite. So it's for those of us who have already got that foundation.
Okay. Well, we'll stay a little bit after, but thank you so much for just great to see so many familiar faces and to meet some new. So thank you so much, everyone. Love this community. Thank you for joining.
And a special thanks to Heather. Heather, thanks so much for making time today, being a part of this and sharing your story. Really do appreciate you you offering your insights.
You're welcome. I'm a huge fan, you know that. So I'm a big advocate and cheerleader for the work.
Well, thank you. It was fantastic to have you with us.
I'll stay on if anybody wants to stick around.
I was going to say, Lynn, if you want to stay on, I'll be happy to answer your question here. I don't know if you're still here.